just came across this crazy Mandela effect. I had to document it. This one is pretty. It's pretty good. Uh, I know a lot of naysayers out there don't believe the Bible is changing, swear that they have been quoting these verses for years. Um, but it's always funny to watch people when you show them something like Delilah does not cut Samson's hair anymore. Moses is not the one whose staff turns into a snake. Um, the lion does not lay down with the lamb. It's really funny to watch people try and rationalize that or say, "Oh yeah, that's it. Always said that." Delilah was never the one to cut Samson's hair. She always called a man in to cut it, and I mean, there's so many. I came across this one last week, or the week before, and then I saw two more right after it, and I forgot about this one. And even the wise right after this one, after I saw this one, I saw the wise virgins, who the five wise virgins now don't just have lamps full of oil; they have extra jugs of oil, or jars in most translations. So not only are their lamps full, but they have extra jars of oil with them. And, it's so shocking when you see a um, change like that right off the bat. It's just shocking how they were never the super duper wise virgins. They were just the wise virgins. And you think about that story, how the foolish virgins didn't have any oil, and they go to the wise virgins and say, give us some of your oil. And the wise virgins say, well, no, we can't give you our oil, because what if we don't have enough oil then? Well, they should have actually been called the selfish virgins, because they had extra jars of oil, not just full lamps, but extra jars. I mean, they probably could have spared some of it. Anyway, that's one of the keys. I come across a quantum effect or a Mandela effect, and it's obvious. I mean, it's shocking at first. Like, can't believe it says that. And then I think through the 10,000 sermons I've sat through and listened to over the years, and how people mull over points again and again. And I'm a very visual reader. When I read the scriptures or anything, I really like to imagine what it is I'm reading. And I've never imagined those wise virgins with extra jugs of oil. Anyway, that wasn't even the crazy one, I didn't think. I mean, it was pretty crazy. And honestly, these let's see if I can get in here to the Bible Hub. Um, these quantum effects, some of them are obviously bad. Genesis 3:15, the devil is no longer defeated in the first messianic prophecy. That one's bad. But this one, Acts 21, and maybe even the five wise virgins. I mean, now they're the super duper wise virgins. They got extra jars of oil with them. Maybe that's a good change. All right. So starting in Acts 26, I was looking for the portion, the apostles telling the Gentiles not to eat food sacrificed to idols. And I came across this part. Paul's arrival at Jerusalem. So when we arrived in Jerusalem, this is Acts 27 or Acts 21:17. When we arrived in Jerusalem, the brothers welcomed us joyfully. The next day, Paul went in with us to see James, and all the elders were present. Paul greeted them and recounted one by one the things that God had done among the Gentiles through his ministry. When they heard this, they glorified God. Then they said to Paul, "You see, brother, how many thousands of Jews have believed, and all of them are zealous for the law. But they are under the impression that you teach all the Jews who live among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children, to observe our customs. What then should we do? They will certainly hear that you have come. Therefore, do what we advise you. There are 4 men with us." This is where it gets really wacky. I remember some of this first part. I don't remember them saying how many thousands of Jews have believed, but I do remember them saying that they're zealous for the law. But he says, therefore, is this James who's speaking? Paul greeted them, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, I think it's James and Peter. Therefore, do what we advise you. There are 4 men with us who have taken a vow. Take these men, purify yourself along with them, and pay their expenses so they can have their heads shaved. Then everyone will know that there is no truth to these rumors about you, but you also live in obedience to the law. As for the Gentile believers, we have written to them our decisions that they must abstain from food sacrificed to idols, from blood, from the meat of strangled animals, and from sexual immorality. So the next day, Paul took the men, purified himself along with them. Then he entered the temple to give notice of the date when their purification would be complete, and the offering would be made for each of them. All right, I don't remember that. I don't remember these 4 guys, Paul paying their expenses to have their heads shaved and doing that all as a ruse to convince the Jews who follow the law that Paul does indeed live in obedience to the law. So it's so strange. So this is about the 4th time I read through this. And what always happens to me is that I'm shocked. I'm like, I've never seen that before. And I've read this passage tons of times. And then I start to try and normalize it. Like my brain, it's right there in the word. My brain tries to normalize it, like fit it in there, like it's always been there. But so when the 7 days were almost over, some Jews from the province of Asia saw Paul at the temple. See, I remember this part. And then they stirred up the whole crowd and seized him, crying out, "Men of Israel, help us. This is the man who teaches everywhere against our people and against our law and against this place. Furthermore, he has brought the Greeks into the temple and defiled this holy place, for they had previously seen Trophimus and the Ephesian with him in the city." Trophimus, I don't I don't remember that guy. And they assumed that Paul had brought him into the temple. The whole city was stirred up. I don't remember that part either. Trophimus, and then the assuming that part. No, I don't remember that. The whole city was stirred up, and the people rushed together. They seized Paul and dragged him out of the temple, and at once the gates were shut. While they were trying to kill him, the commander of the Roman regiment received a report that all Jerusalem was in turmoil. Immediately he took some soldiers and centurions and ran down to the crowd. When the people saw the commander and the soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. The commander came up and arrested Paul, ordering that he be bound with 2 chains. Then he asked who he was and what he had done. Some in the crowd were shouting one thing and some another. And since the commander could not get at the truth because of the uproar, he ordered that Paul be brought into the barracks. When Paul reached the steps, he had to be carried by the soldiers because of the violence of the mob. For the crowd that followed him kept shouting, "Away with him." As they were about to take Paul into the barracks, he asked the commander, "May I say something to you?" "Do you speak Greek?" he replied. Aren't you the Egyptian who incited a rebellion some time ago and led 4,000 members of the assassins into the wilderness? But Paul answered, I am a Jew from Tarsus, in Cilicia, a citizen of no ordinary city. Now I beg you to allow me to speak to the people. Okay. So I remember a lot of that. And I remember Paul coming back to Jerusalem, even though some people make a case for the fact that he should never have come back to Jerusalem. But he came back. And I remember him recounting to the apostles that all the wonderful things God had done to the Gentiles and them rejoicing, and then them saying, there's tons of Jews here who believe and they're all zealous for the law. But then that whole bit about, hey, let's pretend that you haven't been preaching against the law, that everything you've been telling the Gentiles doesn't exist. And in order to prove that, we're going to have you go and purify yourself in the temple according to the law and take these 4 guys and get their heads shaved and recount the days that pure, like none of that stuff. And it's so interesting that it was like this plan to deceive the Jews. I don't remember that at all. And this is Paul who openly rebuked Peter for even insinuating that there was a law. By refusing to eat with the Gentiles, he was just even insinuating, and he got rebuked. So now Paul then apparently agrees, yeah, it's a good idea. I'll go down to the temple and do all this stuff. And he's immediately arrested. Like the way I remember that playing out is that they're all rejoicing. The Gentiles are saved. The Jews are saved. And then Paul goes down to the temple and starts a riot. But all that other stuff, that wasn't in there. And it's so interesting because when he agrees to do that, that's like the end. That's the end for him. He's arrested and he's never free again. I mean, he was never free to begin with, really, a bondservant. But he remains imprisoned until his death. So I just think that's interesting that he's, instead of, he's always preaching against the law and against the law. I mean, he's putting it in its right perspective. This is the thing that he was trying to tell. This was really the main part of his message, that you died to the law. That what the law could not do because it was weak through the flesh, Jesus did in coming in and dying in the flesh. So you can't walk in freedom from sin if you are under the law. And I'm not sure which direction. I wasn't planning on preaching about the law, but he has a lot to say about it. I mean, can you even imagine all the Bible commentaries and all the sermons that you would have heard on how Paul then actually pretends, he like agrees to pretend that he has not been preaching that you shouldn't be circumcised. And, I mean, he went as far as to say in earlier chapters, or maybe it's in Romans, I can't even remember now, where he said, those guys who preach circumcision, he was like, he basically said, I wish they wouldn't stop at the foreskin. I wish they would just cut the whole thing off. That's what he thought about people who preach circumcision. So for him to agree to try and convince the Jews that, oh, yeah, he actually does preach circumcision, is just bananas. Now, why it seems like this could be a good change, or I mean, I'm almost at a loss, is he does say that he became all things to all people, that to those who were under the law, he was one who was under the law. That those who were without the law, he was as the one without a law. And he did that so that he could win some. Um, he says he met people where they're at. But examples of, I mean, you have tons of examples when he's like, I became as one, you know, without a law. You're like, yeah, he was out there eating meat and eating food sacrificed to idols. And I mean, even the apostles, when they told him, yeah, we sent word that, um, you know, we told them the Gentiles they shouldn't eat food sacrificed to idols, and Paul dismantles that even. And he's like, it don't matter if you eat food sacrificed to idols. He's like, the idols are not real; they're demons, and Jesus is bigger than demons. He's like, it's not a big deal. So he even dismantles the little bit of law that they tried to to put on anybody. So, you know, he was continuously dismantling all the rules and regulations and showing how they don't help you at all. Colossians says that following rules may seem wise because it requires discipline, but rule following it's absolutely no help in conquering evil desires. That the only thing that can remove evil desires is the cross, is the mystical transaction where Jesus removed the sinful nature. He made you brand new all the way down to the thoughts and intents of the heart, gave you a brand new heart. Um, so, and if you, he goes into a lot of really deep explanation about the law and how you died. Part of the reason you had to die in Jesus was to come out from the authority of the law. So he says that the law is like a cruel husband and you're a wife. And the husband, the cruel husband, the wife wants to leave her husband and go be with her lover, who's Jesus. And so the law is like a cruel husband that just barks orders and doesn't lift a finger to help you with any of them. And your lover is Jesus, and he makes thousands and thousands of demands on you, but he himself fulfills those demands through you. And you want to leave the law and go be with Jesus, but you have to have a death annul the marriage. And the law is never going to pass away. Not one jot or tittle shall pass away till all be fulfilled. So the only option then is for the wife to die. So you have to die to the law. And that's why Jesus put you to death in himself, was to free you from the law. So there's so much in Paul's ministry that he even says, you know, the Jews came and tried to convince people that you need to be circumcised, and we did not give in to them for 1 second, so that the salvation that we have communicated to you would not be stolen. And it's not a big thing. You know, he's like, if you lift one finger to follow the law, he says, then you're obliged to follow the whole law. And it's just a little thing, you know, circumcision is just done. What's the big deal? Just go ahead and just knock the tip off. Nope. I mean, just done. Paul says, if you even do that, you've fallen from grace. You are under the whole law to do it. And you're outside of grace. You're outside of Jesus doing it through you, because now you're trying to follow the law in your own strength. Now you're in self-righteousness. Now you're in pride. So getting rid of the law, and I mean, it's tough. I remember putting posters up in this office as I'm going into encounters with the fear of the Lord that I'm dead to the law. I mean, I'm really am dead to it. It can sit there and bark orders at me all day long, and a dead person doesn't hear it. and definitely doesn't respond. So it took a lot of, I don't want to say effort, but effort, I don't know. I mean, I had to really, coming out from under the law, I mean, I had to get rid of all that. I got rid of all rules, regulations, everything, and just decided to go only by the voice of the Lord. His sheep hear his voice and follow him. And so what I find is that when I'm following Jesus, I'm not breaking the law at all. It's like you can follow the law from being in a position above the law, which is where Jesus put you. You're way above the law. Um, and if you're staying high on Jesus and living your life in obedience to him, in obedience to peace and joy and love, then you're not going to be breaking the law in any way. But the second you try to follow the law, like the second I try to even make any rule for myself at all, like whatever it is, I'm like, maybe I'm drinking alcohol, and I've noticed this before. I don't really like the fruit of drinking alcohol myself, but I'm free to do whatever I want. The second I make a rule, well, I can't drink alcohol, then the glory and the grace, it just departs. Like I put myself under a law, and maybe I'm just immature. That's a possibility. But as soon as I put myself under any laws, the glory just completely like leaves. Like I can feel it just go instantly. And that's what Paul says. Um, if you lift a finger to follow any of it, then you're bound to all of it, and there's no true freedom there, because the law is not your savior. Jesus is. The law cannot save you from sin. Literally, Paul says in Romans that the law, so far from being able to save you from sin, actually is the power of sin. How crazy is that? I think it's in Corinthians, maybe. I mean, this is something I hardly even, I don't think I understand it, but it says it in so many different ways that the law is the very power of sin. Paul says that the law, that sin dresses up in the law to seduce you, that where there is no law, there is no sin. So he goes into this whole thing about how, where there is no law, there was no sin. And even though sin wasn't imputed, still death reigned. So even though there was no law and thus no sin, people still died and death reigned. Now, as soon as the law came along, it didn't help anybody at all, not because the law was bad, but because we were bad. We were fallen creatures. So the law came in barking orders at us that we couldn't keep all of its requirements, and it couldn't help us to keep any of those requirements. And so it literally became a curse to us because of our fallen state. It literally, the only thing it can do is show us that sin exists. It can't help us with it at all. And then Paul goes as far as to say that it literally, sin dresses up in the law to seduce us. I don't know how that works, but it's like as soon as, well, what I've noticed for myself, as soon as I put myself under a law, it's like the presence of God leaves. And then the only thing that's left is sin. So, it's like the glory and the presence just leaves. Whereas when I throw out all the rules, I'm free to do whatever I want. I just actually don't want to do that stuff. I could do it, but I'm so high already, I don't really want to. I don't want to trade in the highness that is Jesus for this lower this lower this lower bit of intoxication. Um, so anyway, just there's so much to do with the law, and Paul just spent so much time that it's absolutely crazy that he would now decide to deceive the Jews who he wanted their salvation more than anything. I'm not saying he didn't do it. I mean, this could be a real change. This could be a change for the better because it actually does make more sense. Like, as soon as he decided to carry out this thing, this plan of James and Peter, the apostles, to try and convince the Jews that he hadn't been preaching that stuff against the law, it's like his ministry ended. I mean, it didn't end like right then. I mean, he was imprisoned, but it was, you know, that was pretty much the end for Paul. He was taken to Rome and put to death. And when I first read that, I was like, makes perfect sense that, Rick Joyner says he makes a pretty good case for the fact that Paul should not have even gone back to Jerusalem to begin with. That people were saying, you go back to Jerusalem, you're going to be bound and imprisoned and all this stuff. And Rick Joyner says, like, hey, God was telling him not to go to Jerusalem. But then once he got there, then the apostles are like, hey, you need to lie and try and say that you're not following the law. And for whatever reason, one bad decision leads to another. And he's like, yeah, I guess that's a good idea. He goes, gets arrested. It's just, it makes perfect sense, really. Um, but it definitely wasn't in there. I don't remember it ever being in there. Um, kind of want to read the rest of that now, see what else I've been missing.